Well, good afternoon. I'm very pleased to see you all here again. As you know, this is the last presentation of our seminar, of this year's seminar. There's going to be another one next year, but we will not yet announce what it is going to be about. I'm also very pleased to be able to introduce the speaker of this afternoon, Professor Heinz Bude, one of the great German sociologists. And what I've read about him, particularly one of his books, The Society of Fear. This is a book which has been reviewed profusely, but there are also, he is the author of many other books and publications as well. The State of Mind of the World, Capitalism and Inequality, The New Distortions, or The Destiny of the Gutmensch, which is nearly untranslatable, of the good person, but in inverted commas, proposal of being a good person. Welcome, Professor Bude. And, well, you have the floor. Ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish, but I'm very pleased to be here. It is not only a pleasure, but even it's an honor to be here. The last time I was in Madrid is 5 years ago, and before that it was 30 years, and the city certainly is changing a lot, and my wife and myself, we've visited today and are fascinated, and on top of it, we are coming out of the Berlin rain to this warmth, which is nearly a heat, which worries you, but for us it's wonderful. And we have to go back to our rain tomorrow evening and unfortunately have to leave you with your heat. In reality, I would like to convince you about two things. On the one hand side, that in reality, things worldwide are improving, but at the same time, they are worsening. And this is not about the glass, which is half empty or half full, or it's not a compensation because some are richer, others have to be poorer. No, the cake is getting bigger and bigger, and it is true that some are eating less and less of that cake, but on the other hand, this cake that is increasing also has the consequence that the inequality develops in a positive way. Just an example. 20 years ago, for example, both in Germany and in Spain, the quality of life was 20 times better than in China or in India. Nowadays, our quality of life is only 10 times better than in India and in China. So things have taken a positive turn. What's bad about it is that in the same degree in which this has happened during the last 20 years, the inequality within our societies, within the Spanish society, within the German society has increased. That means the inequality between countries is decreasing, and at the same time, the inequality within the national society is increasing. And this paradoxical situation explains the upheaval in our societies, the conflicts, which is interpreted as a polarization of our societies. And it is very difficult to understand this polarization because it is not simply simply the contrast between the have and have-nots, between the marginalized and the establishment. It's not that simple. There is an effective polarization without any bridges between the citizens. And I think this paradoxon that at the same time things are improving and worsening, which is something that explains it. Let's start with the war that we all know, the war in Ukraine. I mean the aggressive war of Putin and the defensive war of Ukraine. And this brings home to us here in Europe a conflict of hegemony. Hegemony means that there is a world, that there is a country in the international world of states that not only has the power, but a country which suggests that it can offer a good quality of life. And the hegemonial power par excellence for the last decades was the United States. For example, the pop culture is a good example. But now there is another candidate, and that's China. China is about to not only be an impressive economic power with the largest internal market in the world, but also a country with another style of life. And there is a conflict between these models. And this conflict is now clear when we watch the war in Ukraine. And compared to that, ni Emmanuel Macron, ni the German Chancellor, nor the Spanish President will have any influence on this war. And the end of this war will not depend even on Putin. The end of this war will depend on Joe Biden and Xi Jinping. China and the US will be decisive for the end of this war. This is what I mean by a conflict of hegemony in the world. And in order to understand the world we live in now, we have to analyze these two powers. Let's begin above. If I say above, I mean above in our societies. Above means the super rich, the ones that own more than 50 million. There are 150,000 super rich in the United States. But in China, there are also 32,000 of those super rich. Germany, number 3, I have to admit, but with only 9,000 super rich. And Spain, bueno, at the end of the list a little bit, but still 2,200 super rich persons in Spain. But what I want to prove with this is that in China there are many, many more super rich people than in Spain. That means there are persons, you all know Jeff Bezos, you know Elon Musk, and you know Mark Zuckerberg, and you know Bill Gates. But probably you've never heard about Zhong Shan, who is the richest man in China, who sells beverages and pharmaceuticals. Maybe you've heard about Zhang Yimin, who invented the video platform TikTok, the most important video platform worldwide. He's Chinese, and maybe you know Jack Ma, the founder of the internet department store Alibaba, the equivalent of Amazon. What I want to say is China and America, where the super rich are concerned, are approaching, and we are lagging behind. Now let's go to the other end of the spectrum and let's analyze what happens there. There we can see that the life expectancy of white men in the US. For white men without a college education, this life expectancy is decreasing continually. Up to 10 years ago, that has never happened, that you could identify a group in the society with a decreasing life expectancy, with a constantly decreasing life expectancy. What is this due to? Obviously, on the one hand side, to nutrition, to malnutrition, too much white flour, too much sugar, too much fat, that increases the tendency to develop diabetes and cardiac diseases. But maybe you've also heard about fentanyl, which is a painkiller, very easy to come by in the United States. And this painkiller probably in the last 10 years has cost the lives of 500,000 people. And I'm talking about the US, for many years, the richest country in the world. In this country, there is a group of people whose life expectancies decreases because they try to overcome the difficulties and the pains in their life with painkillers. And there is a family that owns the company that sells these pain killers, and they have earned a lot of money. And the artist Nan Goldin has started an enormous action against this family, urging the museums to not sponsor that family any longer because it is responsible for the death of hundreds of thousands of people. What would be the parallel group to these white uneducated men in the United States, in China? Well, the migrant workers who really have a very hard life. They work in the building industry, very precarious employment, very bad houses. For a long time, their children were barred from the schools, and their number is around 200 million people. The building boom in China has been possible thanks to this group of migrant workers. So that means that both in the US and in China, there are the super rich on the one hand side and millions of other people in those same societies that have the feeling that they are excluded from the wealth and from the development. In the US, this marginalized group are white. The black men with low education get older than the white men. The white men that don't exercise, that eat too much sugar, too much fat, and they are full of pains and use painkillers. If you like, for some, these people are the so-called white trash, and their life expectancy is the same as in Bolivia. So there is a part of Bolivia in the United States, and in China there is part of the population that lives as poorly as many people in Africa. The topic of the resilience is somewhere in the middle in these societies, takes place in the middle class. The middle class in the United States is decreasing for the first time in 2 generations. For the first time in 2 generations, the number of all poor and rich households together exceed that of middle-class households, measured by income. This is the first time since the Second World War. And that creates the impression in the United States that the spine of the society is disintegrating. What do people in the middle class want? They want what we all want. They want to have a good house or apartment, want to have a car. They like to have entertainment. They've got electronic devices. They want to watch sport, want to do sport, and want an income that enables them to have all that. This middle class exists in China as well. It's a middle class that seeks the same things that our middle class wants. They also want to drive a car. In America, most of the cars are still using petrol. There are hardly any vehicles in the United States. But if in China, all the members of the middle class want to have a car, and that is the case, then at least from a climate point of view, we have a big problem. And the people of the middle class in China know that. They are intelligent. In the United States, the middle class is shrinking. In China, on the other hand, it is expanding, it's growing. But the middle class in China is told you will not have the same development as in the United States. Maybe you'll have to accept that you cannot have as many cars as the Americans, but they will not accept that in China. That means that and the middle class in America is worried and is noting that they're shrinking, and the middle class in China is nervous because they're not sure whether they'll finally be able to enjoy all the benefits that their social position normally entails. What I want to say is that the middle class in both societies is nervous for different reasons. This is what I mean when I say that the lifestyle of these two big societies is approaching more and more. And that at the same time, the inequality within these two societies is exploiting. And there's even talk of plutocracy in the United States. And there's also an explosion of the Chinese middle class, and the Communist Party does not know anymore how to manage the ecological consequences of this explosion. All this is what I mean when I say things are improving and worsening at the same time. Worldwide, the number of the absolutely poor has decreased from 2 billion to 1 billion. Absolute poverty is an income of less than $2 a day. That's the criterion of the World Bank. But no matter what the criterion, the number of absolutely poor has decreased. Why? Because of the development of China. China is responsible for the largest part of this decrease of poverty. Of course, in other parts of the world, poverty has not decreased or disappeared, but in China, it has decreased because the lifestyles are more and more similar, and yet there is this nervousness. And also in parallel, there is a confrontation about the hegemonic position in the world, in the ranking of states in the world. The United States still the most important notion as far as their military superiority is concerned. They have 11 airplane carriers, for example. But at the same time, it's true that China, within no time, will have the largest interior market worldwide. So that gives them a high degree of autarky. The most interesting question here is how these two societies, with their explosive developments, how do they try to manage these developments? Do these two hegemonial powers that are confronted to each other. Now Joe Biden has really initiated a war with China, a technology-based war. The United States don't want to import or export certain technologies from into China, and that will have retaliation. So this is a sort of war right now between those two powers. But I can reassure you, because at the same time, China is the most important creditor of the United States. Before this position was held by Japan, this is where the Americans used to export their debt. Now it's China. So China can have no interest in destroying the United States, because that would destroy their own money. That's reassuring. But as to the lifestyle, as to the regulation, as to the governance of the society, those two countries couldn't be more different. And for example, how does China go about the difference between the super rich, the poor, and the nervous middle class? The answer is the so-called social scoring. In China, there is a very large digital infrastructure that obliges all Chinese citizens to give ample information about all sorts of circumstances of their life and what they do. And it depends on how careful they've been from an ecological point of view, and or how well they've looked after their children. They get bonus points. So privileges in China are the reward for socially responsible behavior. Those citizens with a good score have access to a good schooling or to a good kindergarten, or they can send their daughter to a good university, or they get a bigger flat, or they get permission for more trips abroad. That is no exaggeration. This is how right now China tries to maintain a certain control about its society. The principle is awarding privileges in accordance with fair and just criteria. The United States have another system also based on digital technologies, and that is the promise of digital autonomy, which means social services offered via digital apps, more or less for free. This app will explain to them how they can communicate with their doctor, their health center, their lawyer, where to buy their press, and so on, so that they hardly need to leave the house. And the idea of the American society is that this is a way of keeping the society quiet, offering them for free this basic digital infrastructure. In one case, awarding of controlled privileges, and on the other end, this is what we give you for free, and with this you can now design your own life. If there are two hegemonies in the world that are rivals, then there is always an audience that watches this conflict, and that's us. You in Spain, we in Germany. We are the spectators of this, and we wonder, what do we prefer, the Chinese recipe or the American way? In Germany, I don't know how it is in Spain, but as to the ecological resilience in Germany, there are many people who, behind doors, are in favor of the Chinese model. Why not give advantages to a person who behaves ecologically responsibly? What are the arguments against it? We won't be able to control climate change any other way. If I wander around in Madrid and see these masses of cars, I cannot imagine that this will be reduced in 25% in a few years. But only if somebody we've all been explained that it is not sustainable, but voluntarily we don't seem to be able to give up certain things. So why not the Chinese model? Everybody gets points and scores, and if you don't have enough, we take your car. So every family has one car, and if the behavior is correct, it might have the right to a second car. Or do we prefer the American model? Everybody stays at home after the pandemic. After the pandemia, looks like many people like to not leave their house. This has really surprised me. During the pandemia, obviously, it was obligatory, but after that, some of them have not returned to the streets. They have realized that they can live without leaving the house, a home office. I can practically do everything from home. And I can even listen to this funny Professor Bude from Berlin from my home, and I don't have to leave it. And it's not costing me anything. I guess that we are streaming this for free, so you can do all this for free. Isn't that the better path? Everyone can do what they want, and we inform ourselves about what's ecologically sustainable, and can do that at home as well. 1,000 steps a day without leaving our flat. The app tells us how much water you have to drink, and you can even buy an app for the generation of rubbish. And the app tells you, well, now you've already spent too much plastic. Now you have to start buying things that are not wrapped in plastic. Isn't that a good solution? The European model is different. The European model tells us we cannot control the population via awards and privileges, and not through this autonomy. No, in the European world, there is another concept, and that's the rights of the citizens. The European societies really believe that the concept of the state of law, of the social state of law, and the tradition of civil rights is the secret. That means to earn the right to social participation, and that is the way to achieve a certain behavior on the part of the citizens. For example, you work in order to gain your right of having a retirement pension. So you don't work because you want to work, but if you don't work, you know you won't have a pension fund. And the civil rights have the wonderful effect that they turn inequality in something that's bearable. Because if we all have exactly the same rights, then the state, all it has to do is to increase this basis so that we have that we really have equal opportunity. But whether we have more or less success, that's our own merit. But the problem is that this logic dilutes or weakens the initiative or the wish to really participate. There is a trend to take for granted certain social services, and one stops wondering how much that all costs and what are our duties to really earn these social benefits. China has a problem which has come to light during the pandemia, and that is that this targeted awarding of privileges doesn't work anymore. China could react to the pandemia with an immediate lockdown in a way that was unimaginable. You had a little taste of that here in Spain, but the problem in China was that the lockdown was easy to impose, but the process of opening was complicated. The undoing of the lockdown, the slow opening has generated an enormous number of casualties in China. The opening. And the opening after Corona has led to so much social unrest that the party couldn't control it any longer. The massive loyalty that existed for so long is endangered now. The total loyalty to the party doesn't work anymore. And so the privileges can't solve that anymore. The targeted awarding of privileges depends on an unlimited amount of resources. And when these resources decrease, when the economic growth decreases, that's not possible anymore. So on the one hand side, the loyalty to the party is disturbed, and on the other hand, there are not enough resources to keep granting the privileges to the citizens. That's the case in China. In America, the country, in these times of digital autonomy, turns into a country increasingly unmanageable or ungovernable. To discipline people is not possible any longer. I have explained it with the example of the painkillers, and the social media and their massive use has created a totally divided society without contact between each other, and there will be a collapse of the political participation. In the mid-term in America, we'll have an apolitical society that can only be kept under control with entertainment. Two really terrible perspectives. I think that the world needs Europe. I think we cannot leave these two powers alone with their two recipes. Both recipes are bad. They need us. They need Spain. They need Germany. They need Europe. They are at the end of their ways. China right now is now desperate. They don't know how to get back the loyalty of their masses, how to manage the increasing the aging population. Now, the policy of one child only, there is no infrastructure for the care of the elderly, and there are not the associations, the churches, the social institutions that could fill that gap. So China right now is a society that, from a social point of view, is heading towards zero. And in the US, none of us would like to live anymore. There are many colleagues that are not interested any longer in working in an American university because they've had enough of these cultural wars there where people can't talk to each other anymore. They just don't want to go there anymore. The nervous tension is too much. People want to live where they can still talk with each other, where they can still solve problems together. So civil rights, that's our solution here in Europe. And I'm approaching the end. That is possible with one condition, and that's a very hard condition. We have to realize in our European countries that the awarding of civil rights and social justice needs the solidarity of the citizens. In Germany, at least, this discourse about justice is obsessive right now. They try to bridge gaps of equality and of justice, and nobody is asking the question: what happened to the solidarity? There are many authors who describe society that needs this solidarity. A society that is only fair but doesn't have solidarity is a cold society. Justice, social justice, is a terrible criterion if it's the only one. But you can also conceive a solidary society in which you wouldn't want to live. And we both come from society where we have lived in societies where we experienced both extremes. Fascism, for example, is one of our experiences. And this is an experience we have in common. We both know what happens when there is an absolute model of solidarity. This ends in fascism. And we also have lived, or at least in Germany, we have lived in social market economy with a lot of solidarity, but with not enough justice. So we need to combine both solidarity and civil rights. Through our fair efforts, we earn our civil rights, and all that embedded in a solidary environment where we all understand what is fair, what is just, and if we are prepared to work for it, then we have the possibility of generating social resilience. That is what we can offer to China and to the US, and that's why they depend on us. Thank you very much for your attention. Now, let's see if there are questions. I think this has been a very provocative presentation. I know Professor Bude, and I expected that he would provoke us, and that's very good. While you think about questions you may have, I'll start with one. And that's a question that has to do with this third way that he has described, Europe. Now, as we observe what's happening in France lately, just to mention an example, or also in Italy, where we don't know what is going to happen with the extreme right, if they are going to enter into a coalition with a moderate middle center-right party. Well, there is also a certain radicalization. So we mightn't have the same situation as in the United States, but there are tendencies like that in our societies that are really a worry. I think that from the point of view of the German Federal Republic, which is a country that from a political point of view, there are no extreme vetoes among the political parties, where the coalitions are possible and the governance is guaranteed. So from that point of view, Germany maybe doesn't understand how difficult it is in other countries to create coalitions in an environment of constant fragmentation. And in many occasions, and this is the case in Spain, this leads to polarization, which being far away from the polarization in the United States does still have something in common with it. So this polarization also has an affective component. The distance isn't ideological, it is emotional, the difference in distance between the members of these different blocs. So there I see a danger, which can also lead to a destabilization of the European societies. Not like in China, obviously, and not exactly like in the United States. But our model is not exactly a model for stability, but a third type of model. Yes, that's true. Maybe I've depicted a slightly too optimistic picture of Europe, and that's maybe one of the curiosities that also in the European societies there is a polarization due to fear, but we have to be careful here. In Germany, I often see the problem that often the difference between fear and hate isn't made clearly enough. Because very often when we say fear, in reality, we mean hatred. To go back to the United States, Donald Trump, who I really think will not ever be an American president again. But he certainly has had a very important, effective influence on the Western world. He has given us the license to hate. And that is something that all the extreme right and left-wing movements in Europe have in common. And what's the difference between hatred and fear? Fear is a mood or a feeling that in reality is a sort of impotence with regard to certain things. Like, for example, how can we go on living if things get worse or better at the same time all the time? Then you want to have a clear situation. Things are either better or worse. It can't be both. There are many dystopias where people write about it and saying things are getting worse and worse. And when I tell them, no, not everything is getting worse. There are more girls with access to education. Oh, you only want to reassure us. I said, no, but this is true. And I also say, well, but at the same time, there are many people who don't make it in our social networks. So then they say, you see, things getting worse. Things are getting worse. Well, this is the fear that comes from this uncertainty. But hatred is another, is something else. Hatred is a drug. It makes you feel that you can move something, that you can achieve something by hating. Hatred comes with the neoliberal basic concept, which has become part of our language, and that is the idea that you need to achieve something in life, that you need to have an effect. My life is good only if I can make a difference. But normally I don't achieve that in my job. And then hatred tells me, but you can achieve something. You can achieve hatred. Hatred is a drug that makes me hit with my fist on the table, and then people look at me, and then and that's the problem that we have in Europe. And it is very interesting to see that hatred is due to different motives in the different European countries. The hatred in France has become part of the politics. The gilet mauve, the gilet jaune against Emmanuel Macron. I was in France during the electoral campaign in France in the countryside, and I was really shocked by this blind hatred against Emmanuel Macron. Very nice people in the village, the butcher, the baker. We were chatting away, but the moment Emmanuel Macron was mentioned, they would just freak out, and I couldn't understand it. And when I told them, but this reform of the pensions is necessary, it's crazy what you want. And then immediately said, you're a neoliberal, just like Emmanuel Macron. And I said, well, nothing far from the truth when I simply tell you that you'll manage to bring the whole social system to the collapse. But not like this. He is a man of the banks, of the Rothschild tribe. And then I said, what, now you're anti-Semitic as well? That's hatred. That's a very irrational hatred. But there is also the anti-political hatred, and that we witness in Germany, where they say politics is bad. What you need is micropolitics. These are the people who right now are blocking the airports. They say politics is good for nothing because we are not fighting climate change. What could the solution be? A purification of the political topics that can be solved. because I fear, I don't like the term climate crisis, because most of it, like the high temperatures that you have in Spain here right now, can't be undone. That's not possible. That point is beyond us. The decision, there can't be decisions that undo this damage. So now what we have to do is to adapt in an intelligent way to this climate change. And that's what resilience is. It's a transformation of adaptation and not trying to stop what's unstoppable. Well, I say what you can and what you can't do. If I do that as a politician, then they tell me, well, you don't want to realize what's really happening. I says, I realize very well what's happening. I'm only saying where you can do something and where you can't do anything. So there are certain things that are not possible anymore. I'm afraid that in Spain it's even more complicated because of different regional hatreds. So, but this hatred due to these big social topics, that is something we also see in Germany. So what we have to do is to get the hatred out of politics. When I speak with the parties in Germany, they say, what we need is a new narrative. And I always say, forget about narratives. You can't tell people things that are not true. That's the problem. You're looking for a narrative instead of looking for reality. Forget about narratives.
Forget about disruption.
And this whole jargon, forget about it. We need to find vocabulary for all the things that we can still solve from a political point of view. Human beings are a geological power that has destroyed things, and that cannot be undone. And I'm not even saying this from a negative point of view. We have to realize that in order to get back our collective capacity of doing something, of finding solutions, and of creating a fair society with a lot of solidarity.
Wie soll ich das sagen? Und unseren Solidaritätsanteilen im Grunde an die Gesellschaft bindet.
And that way creates cohesion. So I want that we are fair. I want that we understand what's really going on, and I want to understand what we all have to do in order to survive and to adapt. But I'm not prepared any longer to accept things that are just not true and not possible anymore. Yes, then. Are there more questions? Otherwise, I would continue. Is there some question from the people who are listening to us from outside? Well, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation. There's a question from the audience online, which has to do with a quote from Branko Milanovic, the economist, and he has said that the workers of the emerging industries have benefited from the latest development, and not so the workers in the developed societies. And Milanovic thinks So what this person wants to know is whether you agree with Milanovic or whether you have another opinion. Maybe we could add the second question as well. Well, it's a similar question to this first one. One of our spectators asks whether protectionist measures like the United States are applying with regard to goods imported from Europe, if they are able to decrease the inequality and would lead to a better distribution of income between the different levels of the society or layers of the society. Well, the argument of Mikhailovich, I do know, and I think he was right during the last 20 years, but not any longer, at least analyzing the situation in Germany. In Germany, we have the problem that we have insufficient labor. We have enough work, but there are not enough workers. We have a demographic problem, which is dramatic in Germany right now. So the working population in Germany, but particularly the skilled workers, and who have been pushed out of the industry by the China shock. Well, that's a theory that was true 10 years ago, but right now we live at a point in time where material values are coming back. But we simply have an insufficient number of human beings. There are many employments that cannot be covered, and that leads to a decrease in the economic development. I think you haven't yet reached that point in Spain, but it will come because the demographic situation in Spain is also very bad. So that means that right now in Europe, the difficult situation now with the baby boomers getting into to retirement age in the long run, that can save us. And the same is true for the world population, which from the year 2045 probably also will decrease. This is an uncomfortable truth for me. I, in my times, read the forecasts of the Club of Rome saying we would have finally a world population above 15 billion people. It will only be 9 and maybe only 6 finally. Well, that is a good way of saving the world and the planet. But meanwhile, the growth rate in our societies will decrease dramatically. And that is the problem. We have overcome the China shock in our economies, but now we have a new problem, which is not having enough people. And I must admit, there are also too many people who don't want to work much. I personally, I must say, I enjoy working. I don't want to brag with it, and I have a nice job and I enjoy my job. So I'm lucky that way. And so I write and talk and say that's sociology. So I should be careful. But I'm basically, it's not good when people do not like to work or want to work very little, and that finally leads to less richness in a society. Protectionism can be a good instrument in order to help certain economic areas in crisis, can help reactivate them. Right now in Europe, there are not too many economic areas that have to be reactivated with protectionism. The United States right now trying out an experiment with Joe Biden that I find interesting, but that's not fitting for Europe, because we don't need to strengthen the car industry. We don't need to support the metal industry, nor do we have to help the internet industry. We have to support or promote or strengthen other economic areas, for example, the care industry, the measures that help us die with dignity. These are topics that are interesting for the European societies, and they require a lot of economic activity. So, as you can see from that point of view, I'm relatively optimistic.
Eso está muy bien.
Well, that's good
Un punto optimista.
to hear somebody saying that is optimistic. Is there any other observation? Well, I'm really enjoying listening to Professor Bude because he is very optimistic as far as Europe is concerned, and I agree with him because, in my opinion, what is sort of underlying this whole discourse is that there are two big world powers that don't seem to understand that homeostatic processes destroy any type of provision. Well, that sounds a bit abstract, but if I have an economic forecast, forecasting that in a certain country there'll be a growth rate of 5%, well, we don't really know the theory of systems, and we can't apply it correctly. And that is very serious because this theory of the systems has its origin in the United States, and they should know about it. But instead, there is a tendency to correct the linear regressions in order to make homeostasis possible again. And the normal citizen really doesn't care about all that, but the political leader get very alarmed by it. They can't really stand it. And that leads to very authoritarian governments that try to correct this homeostatic approach that is also called the negative retroalimentation loop. And this is happening all the time. This is something we need to know. And this leads to authoritarian or even totalitarian societies in the worst case scenario. What's happening in Europe? Well, in Europe, we in Europe, we have been through fascist governments, and we are now accustomed, we are used to living with the conflict. What Professor Bude calls hatred, I would call conflict. We, the Europeans, have learned to live with the conflict. And I'm happy to see that we are in a continent where conflicts can be solved finally. I think two of your arguments are very important. I agree with the first. Kahneman has written a wonderful book about fast and slow thinking. And I think we should apply that to politics. There are political measures that have to be fast, others that have to be long-term. The long-term politics is a politics that develops along several mandates. For example, the housing policy. Housing policy is slow, but at the same time, people need fast measures. For example, the war in Ukraine requires fast political measures, not slow political measures. And I agree with you that we in Europe have lost the understanding that both are necessary, long-term and short-term politics. If there is only long-term policy, we have technical governments. But if we only have short-term politics, this sort of policy can also be very destructive, but because we end up forgetting what it is we are responding to. And I think you are also right when you say how can we define a new relationship between fast and slow policy. For the slow policy, people like you and me come into play. We have to help divide that. During the pandemic, we were in danger because people started to see how little science really knows, and that's not true. I always say science is very important in democracy because it is not possible to conceive democracy without science. Because we have to believe that people are able to learn. Once you don't believe in that anymore, you are not a democrat anymore. And this capacity of learning, also of learning of democracy, that always requires slow processes. And this policy of long-term strategies is a very important question. The second point, what remind me of your second point? I've now forgotten it. You had mentioned a second point. So the system of the theory of the systems, which I think I had tried to answer to, and then you had a second question, and I even had the solution. Yeah, hatred and conflict. That's true. Somebody has reminded. There was an important German sociologist, Ralph Dahrendorf. He said that modern democracy is a system that creates integration through conflict. The problem is that Dahrendorf's world doesn't exist anymore. In that world, the protagonists of the conflict were defined. The big companies and the societies, but nowadays we don't know exactly anymore who are the counterparts in a conflict. So we need a culture of culture, and so we need to know who brings which sort of conflict to the table, and right now that is not clear. And the model integration through conflict can only work if we have legitimate conflict addresses. And I think this is a problem nowadays. Who are the forces that cause conflict that we can remit to?
Si no les amenazo con ser yo quien interviene. Bueno, he intervenido. Bueno, yo tengo dos cuestiones. Bueno, no, una cuestión realmente.
There are two things that I would like to talk about. Maybe to complement this differentiation between slow and fast politics. it is also conceivable. There's also another type of dynamic here in Spain, particularly, and all these regional forces, but also the difference defined by Italo Calvino between lightheartedness and heavy-heartedness. So we've got a frivolous part of the society, and on the other hand, there are people that can only think of their existence being very profound. This also leads to conflicts in the society, and frivolous versus profound. But even the profound thinkers are exposed to the discourses in the press and by the politicians, which are more and more superficial. So this brings us back to the problem of how to discuss things, and if the means that we use to talk about problems is adequate. For example, in order to talk about issues that are very profound, we would need a much more long-term policy instead of this short-term policy, this daily politics. This is an observation, so if you don't want to make any comments, you don't need to, but then I also have a question. A question about solidarity versus justice. And when you said that justice alone is something that terrifies you, but at the same time, you also explained that it would be impossible to tolerate injustices, and that solidarity was what could solve that situation. And that reminded me of Judith Clark, who says that the problem are the injustices, and that we have to simply analyze how we can define the emotion that injustice generates, because this is the feeling of the yellow vests in France, the hatred with regard to Macron, and so on. And if we look at regional conflicts and look at France, probably one of the countries that invests more than any other in social services. This is a country that cannot be accused of being an unfair and unjust country because it now wants to increase the retirement age from 62 to 64. If these revolutions in the street happened in Poland or in Spain, it would be more comprehensible. But it's this feeling associated to a perceived injustice.
Ja, das ist, vielleicht bleibe ich noch, ich würde für den Moment die Sache, Ihren zweiten Punkt sogar noch mehr verkomplizieren.
I'd like to even make matters more complicated. I'd like to talk about the law.
Der große Vorteil des Rechts in Gesellschaft
the great advantage of the law in a society is that the law permits you to establish what the law is, and then a sentence is dictated, and that sentence that has to be accepted. So the law is a legitimate way of putting an end to discussions. In Germans, we have the Constitutional Court of Law. This is an institution that is turned to, this is addressed very often in trying to find a solution to things. And once there is a sentence by the constitutional law, this is the final answer. So law, understood in that sense, is essential for our lives. I remember as a young man, I once saw a theater play in Berlin about the Odyssey and the birth of law in Greece. And what I understood is that if everybody wants to be right all the time and turns that into a condition for living with others, well, somebody finally has to come and say, well, enough, not everybody can be right, and we have to have a ruling. And I thought that was something very truly liberating, the interruption of eternal debates and discussions. And there are people who don't understand that right and law is something wonderful. So in a certain way, I advocate the return of certain concepts because they are real. Law is not only an institution, it's a concept of reality. For example, there is a term that I have started to dislike, is complexity. If somebody starts by saying, this is very complex, normally that means things are looking bad for me. So that means to me attention. He is going to say that you're going to get less pension or whatever. As soon as something is called complex, it means that somebody is starting to lie. What about elementary? I think that the discourse of the social sciences has hidden behind supposed complexities, and so has politics. I have the impression that we need to go back to elementary concepts. This sounds a bit like Carl Schmitt, a German thinker who not only awakens positive associations, but the concept of what is essential or elementary has been very well defined by him. In Germany, there is a subject in school called something like social sciences, where students supposedly are taught what politics is all about. And I'm often asked, but how do you achieve their attention? Because they don't want to listen to us explaining how democracy works. They want to watch television or TikTok or whatever. And then what I reply is maybe they would be interested in defining in what we believe when we believe in democracy. When I say I believe in democracy, we could ask ourselves, well, what do you mean by that? And maybe we can make the conversation easier by saying you don't have to believe in democracy. It's not necessary. But if you believe in democracy, what is it that you believe? Maybe believe in the fact that everybody is entitled to a voice and that every voice is valuable. But I think there are also a bigger number of voices that are necessary before a decision is taken. and one single voice can make the difference.
Ja, aber ist das gerecht? Nein, aber
I like that, but is that fair? Probably not, but it's to do with many complex processes. What I want to say is that
aufschiebende Begriff der Komplexität,
the concept of complexity that simply tries to postpone things and the law also, law and right is a way of interrupting endless debates. And so I think we should go back to the elementary questions and which is the type of justice that I want to defend. Nobody can tell me that the French Republic is in danger if people work 2 years longer. That is absolutely nonsense. Nobody can believe that. It is possible that people believe that they are not listened to. That is possible. In Germany, I don't know how it is in Spain, but in Germany, I hear more and more people saying, well, I'm alone with my problems. No politicians listen to me when I ask them, what are your problems? And very often it is pretty absurd what people say when you ask them about their problems. But for them, these problems are important. And very often it's hard to accept that they are relevant. So all this, if we don't reflect upon these things the way we are doing it here tonight, then we don't have anything to offer to China or to the US. So this is what I would reply to what you said. Finally, everything is of a very elementary nature. What does it mean to have a voice? Judith Butler has written about it. What does it mean to have a voice in a meeting? What does it to raise one's voice and to defend one's voice with one's body? These are very important things that cannot be done by a click. Well, thank you so much, Professor Bude. This brings us to the end of today's session, end of our seminar. I hope that you've enjoyed it and that you'll come back next year because we'll bring another topic to the table. Thank you all very much.